Elmina Castle was erected by Portuguese in 1482 as São Jorge Mina Castle, also known simply as Mina or Feitoria da Mina, in present-day Elmina, Ghana. It was the first trading post built on the Gulf of Guinea, so is the oldest European building in existence below the Sahara. First established as a trade settlement, the castle later became one of the most important stops on the route of the Atlantic slave trade. The Dutch seized the fort from the Portuguese in 1637, and took over all the Portuguese Gold Coast in 1642. The slave trade continued under the Dutch until 1814. In 1872 the Dutch Gold Coast, including the fort, became a possession of the British Empire. Britain granted the Gold Coast its independence in 1957, and control of the castle was transferred to the nation formed out of the colony, present-day Ghana. Today Elmina Castle is a popular historical site, and was a major filming location for Werner Herzog's 1987 drama film Cobra Verde. The castle is recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. History. Pre-Portuguese, the people living along the West African coast at Elmina around the 15th century were presumably Fante. The Fante ethnicity bears an uncertain relationship to Akan, itself a word connoting originality from the root word can, to be first or original. Among their ancestors were merchants and miners trading gold into the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds from medieval times. The ancestors of the Akan speakers of the forests, however, undoubtedly came from north of the forest. The people on the West African coast were organized into numerous populations that were drawn according to kinship lines. Family was extremely important in society, and family heads were united in communities under a recognized local authority. Along the Gold Coast alone, more than 20 independent kingdom-states existed. Elmina lay between two different Fante kingdoms, Feto and Igufo. While there was a relative degree of interstate rivalry, peoples generally intermingled freely. Trade between localities was important for the economy. The coastal people also had strong trade relations with the Sudanese empires to the north. West Africans nurtured ancient connections to other parts of the world. Common metals trade, iconic artistic forms, and agricultural borrowing show that trans-Saharan and regional coastal connections thrive. The Portuguese in 1471 were the first Europeans to visit the Gold Coast as such, but not necessarily the first sailors to reach the port. Portuguese arrival. The Portuguese first reached what became known as the Gold Coast in 1471. Prince Henry the Navigator first sent ships to explore the African coast in 1418. The Portuguese had several motives for voyaging south. They were attracted by rumors of fertile African lands that were rich in gold and ivory. They also sought a southern route to India so as to circumvent Arab traders and establish direct trade with Asia. In line with the strong religious sentiments of the time, another focus of the Portuguese was Christian proselytism. They also sought to form an alliance with the legendary Prester John, who was believed to be the leader of a great Christian nation somewhere in Africa. These motives prompted the Portuguese to develop the Guinea trade. They made gradual progress down the African coast, each voyage reaching a point further along than the last. After 50 years of coastal exploration, the Portuguese finally reached Elmina in 1471, during the reign of King Afonso V. However, because Portuguese royalty had lost interest in African exploration as a result of meager returns, the Guinea trade was put under the oversight of the Portuguese trader, Fernão Gomes. Upon reaching present-day Elmina, Gomes discovered a thriving gold trade already established among the natives and visiting Arab and Berber traders. He established his own trading post, and it became known to the Portuguese Portuguese as Elmina because of the gold that could be found there. Construction of the castle trade between Elmina and Portugal grew throughout the decade following the establishment of the trading post under Gomez. In 1481, the recently crowned João II decided to build a fort on the coast in order to ensure the protection of this trade, which was once again held as a royal monopoly. King João sent all of the materials needed to build the fort on 10 caravels and 2 transport ships. The supplies, which included everything from heavy foundation stones to roof tiles, were sent in pre-fitted form, along with provisions for 600 men. Under the command of Diogo de Azambuja, the fleet set sail on the 12th of December 1481 and arrived at Elmina, in a village called of Two Parts a little over a month later, on the 19th of January 1482. Some historians note that Christopher Columbus was among those to make the voyage to the Gold Coast with this fleet. Upon their arrival, Azambuja contracted a Portuguese trader who had lived at Elmina for some time, to arrange and interpret an official meeting with the local chief, Guaman Ansa. Concealing his self-interest with elegant manners and friendliness, Azambuja told the chief of the great advantages in building a fort, including protection from the very powerful King of Portugal. During the meeting, Azambuja and Chief Guaman Ansa both participated in a massive peace ritual that included a feast, live musicians, and many participants, both Portuguese and native. Chief Guaman Ansa, while accepting Azambuja as he had any other Portuguese trader who arrived on his coast, was wary of a permanent settlement. However, with firm plans already in place, the Portuguese would not be deterred. After offering gifts, making promises, and hinting at the consequences of non-compliance, the Portuguese finally received Guaman Ansa's reluctant agreement. When construction began the next morning, the chief's reluctance was proved to be well-founded. In order to build the fort in the most defensible position on the peninsula, the Portuguese had to demolish the homes of some of the villagers, who consented only after they had been compensated. The Portuguese also tried to quarry a nearby rock that the people of Elmina, who were animists, believed to be the home of the god of the nearby river Benya. Prior to the demolition of the quarry and homes, Azambuja sent a Portuguese crew member, João Bernaldes, with gifts to deliver to Chief Guaman Ansa and the villagers. Azambuja sent brass basins, shawls, and other gifts in hopes of winning the goodwill of the villagers, so they would not be upset during the demolition of the homes and sacred rocks. However, João Bernaldes did not deliver the gifts until after construction began, by which time the villagers became upset upon witnessing the demolition without forewarning a compensation. In response to this, the local people forged an attack that resulted in several Portuguese deaths. Finally, an understanding was reached, but continued opposition led the Portuguese to burn the local village in retaliation. Even in this dense atmosphere, the first story of the tower was completed after only 20 days. This was the result of having brought so much prefabricated building materials. The remainder of the fort and an accompanying church were completed soon afterward, despite resistance. Immediate impact: the fort was the first prefabricated building of European origin to have been planned and executed in sub-Saharan Africa. Upon its completion, Elmina was established as a proper city. Azambuja was named governor, and King João added the title Lord of Guinea to his noble titles. São Jorge de Mina took on the military and economic importance that had previously been held by the Portuguese factory at Arguim Island on the southern edge of the Moorish world. At the height of the gold trade in the early 16th century, 24,000 ounces of gold were exported annually from the Gold Coast, accounting for 1/10 of the world's supply. The new fort, signifying the permanent involvement of Europeans in West Africa, had a considerable effect on Africans living on the coast. At the urging of the Portuguese, Elmina declared itself an independent state whose governor then took control of the town's affairs. The people of Elmina were offered Portuguese protection against attacks from neighboring coastal tribes, with whom the Portuguese had much less genial relations if any locals attempted to trade with a nation other than Portugal. The Portuguese reacted with aggressive force, often by forming alliances with the betraying nation's enemies. Hostility between groups increased, and the traditional organization of native societies suffered, especially after the Portuguese introduced them to firearms, which made the dominance of the stronger nations easier. Trade with the Europeans helped make certain goods, such as cloth and beads, more available to the coastal people. But European involvement also disrupted traditional trade routes between coastal people and northern people by cutting out the African middlemen. The population of Elmina swelled with traders from other towns hoping to trade with the Portuguese, who gradually established a West African monopoly. Atlantic slave trade. By the 17th century, most trade in West Africa concentrated on the sale of slaves. Sahara.Da Mina played a significant part in the Atlantic slave trade. The castle acted as a depot where slaves were bought in bartering fashion from a local African chiefs and kings. The slaves, often captured in the African interior by the slave catchers of coastal peoples, were sold to Portuguese traders in exchange for goods such as textiles and horses. The slaves were held captive in the castle before exiting through the castle's infamous door of no return, to be transported and resold in newly colonized Brazil and other Portuguese colonies, controlled by other European nations. In 1637 the fort was taken over by the Dutch, who made it the capital of the Dutch Gold Coast. During the period of Dutch control, they built a new, smaller fortress on a nearby hill to protect St. George Castle from inland attacks. This fort was called Fort Koenraadsburg. The Dutch continued the triangular Atlantic slave route until 1814, when they abolished the slave trade, pursuant to the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814. In 1872 the British took over the Dutch territory pursuant to the Anglo-Dutch Sumatra Treaties of 1871. Renovation. The castle was extensively restored by the Ghanaian government in the 1990s. Renovation of the castle continues. The bridge leading into the castle is one of the highest priority tasks in the project. As of August 2006, the bridge renovation has been completed and construction on the upper terrace continues. Gallery.